The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Sophia Marlowe always thought was a terrible day for the worst news of your life. It came sealed in black wax, pressed with a crest she had only ever seen in history books, a crown sitting above a pair of crossed bones, the ancient mark of the Draven bloodline. The paper itself was heavier than normal paper. Colder. She touched it with 2 fingers the way a person touches something they are not sure is dead yet. Her father, King Edward Marlowe, sat across the long oak table in his study with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her left shoulder. He had been the king of Alden Mere for 31 years. He had commanded armies. He had buried a wife and 2 sons and kept breathing. He was not a man who looked away from things. He was looking away from Sophia now. She read the letter once. Then, again. The second time she read it slower, the way you reread something when your brain is refusing the meaning of the words. "You cannot be serious," she said. "Sophia." "Father." Her voice came out flat. Not angry yet. Anger was still loading somewhere behind her sternum, working its way up. "This is a marriage contract. With Caius Draven. I know what it is. Caius Draven, who is 400 years old. Who rules the Nocturne Court. Who has not left his mountains in 60 years because the last human king who invited him to dinner ended up as the dinner." She set the letter down on the table with great precision, the way a person sets something down when they want to throw it. "That Caius Draven. The war has been moving south for 2 years," Edward said. "The Nocturne Court controls the mountain passes. Without those passes, our supply lines are. I know what the supply lines are." "Then, you know we are going to lose. Not this season. Maybe not next. But, we are going to lose, Sophia. And, when the Nocturne Court decides to stop staying neutral and picks a side, it will not matter which side they pick. Either way we are finished." He finally looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges in the way that had nothing to do with sleep. "This is the only card we have." Sophia looked at her hands on the table. She had her mother's hands, people always said. Long fingers, slightly ink-stained at the tips. She had been studying diplomacy since she was 9 years old. She had read every treaty, every negotiation record, every history of how kingdoms had kept themselves alive. She understood exactly what her father was doing. She understood that it made sense. She hated that it made sense. "When?" she asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 21 days. She was going to be married to a 400-year-old vampire king in 21 days because the world had backed her country into a corner and this was the only door left. He agreed to it, she said. It was not quite a question. He proposed it. That landed differently. She picked the letter back up and read the 3rd paragraph again, the part her shock had skipped the first 2 times. The proposal had come from the Draven side. Caius himself had sent the offer through his ambassador. A treaty marriage. The Princess of Alden Mere, in exchange for the mountain passes and 100 years of nocturne neutrality in all human conflicts. He had asked for her specifically. She did not sleep for 2 nights after that. The Nocturne Mountains took 4 days to reach by carriage, and Sophia spent most of that time in the kind of numb, floating state that happens when your brain has processed something too large and decided to simply stop processing for a while. Her handmaid Lena sat across from her, small and dark-haired, with the kind of steady face that people develop when they love someone who is always in trouble. "You could eat something," Lena said, on the 2nd morning. "I could. The bread is good. The innkeeper's wife baked it this morning." "Lena." "Sophia. I am writing to marry a man who drinks blood and has not attended a human social function since before my grandmother was born. I am not going to eat the bread." Lena looked at the bread. Then, at Sophia. Then, she ate the bread herself. "He has not killed any of his previous wives," she said. "He has not had previous wives. He has had previous political hostages." "Same thing. Those women came home, eventually. They were alive. Some of them were even." Lena paused. "Well. Fine is a strong word. But, functional. Sophia turned to look out the window at the darkening landscape. The trees here were older than the trees near home. Taller. The roots broke through the ground in thick knots and the bark was a shade of gray that felt wrong, the way a lot of things this far north felt wrong, like the land itself was aware of something and had gone quiet about it. What do you know about him? Sophia asked. Lena was quiet for a moment. He is old. The oldest of the Draven line. He took the throne when he was already 200 years old, after his father went mad and had to be contained. He has never lost a war. He has never started one either, which people say is more impressive. She paused. They say he is cold. Not cruel. There is a difference. There is a difference, Sophia agreed. She was going to hold on to that difference with both hands. The Nocturne Court sat at the top of a mountain that the maps labeled in small, apologetic lettering. The castle was not dramatic the way castles in stories were dramatic, no dramatic spires, no theatrical black stone. It was simply enormous. It had been built over centuries, each generation adding to it, and the result was something that felt less like architecture and more like geology. It had grown. It had not been designed. Sophia stepped out of the carriage in the late afternoon and the cold hit her the way cold only hits at altitude, total and immediate, no warning, no gradation. The courtyard was full of people who were not quite people. She had met vampires before. There were a handful of old families in Aldenmere who had taken the Draven oath generations ago and stayed. But this was different. This was 100 of them, standing in perfectly organized rows, dressed in dark formal clothing, watching her with eyes that caught the dying light in ways human eyes did not. She walked the length of that courtyard without looking at the ground. Lena had told her, twice on the last day of travel, that she would be watched from the moment the carriage stopped. That how she carried herself in the next 10 minutes would be what this court remembered for the next 100 years. Lena said things like that with the tone of a woman who did not want to be dramatic but also genuinely meant it. Sophia walked like she had been walking into rooms her whole life. He was at the top of the steps. She had expected old. Old in the way that very powerful old things look old, hollowed out, thin, maintained by force of will alone. She had expected cold eyes and formal clothes and the particular kind of stillness that statues had. Caius Draven was none of those things. He was tall. Not aggressively tall, not the kind of tall that announces itself, but the kind that you only register when you're standing in front of it. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, longer on top, the kind of careless that takes effort. His face was all clean angles, jaw, cheekbone, brow assembled with the precision of something that has had 400 years to settle into itself. His eyes were the color of old iron. Not black. Not gray. Something in between that had its own name and she didn't know it. He was looking at her the way she had been looking at him. Assessing. Careful. Like both of them were reading a document they had agreed to sign without having read first. Princess Marlowe, he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not dramatic about it. Just low, the way stone was cold, without trying. King Draven, she said. A pause. One beat too long to be comfortable. Short enough to be ambiguous. Welcome to the Nocturne Court, he said. She smiled the way she had been trained to smile, warm enough to be polite, controlled enough to mean nothing. Thank you for having me. He looked at her mouth when she smiled. Then, back at her eyes. His expression did not change. He turned and led her inside and she followed 3 steps behind him, the way the protocol notes had specified, and she did not let herself wonder what he had been looking for. The wedding was 3 days later. It was not a small ceremony. The Nocturne Court did not do small ceremonies. It turned out that vampires had opinions about spectacle, and those opinions were strong. The great hall was lit with hundreds of black candles and the smell of them was like smoke and cold mountain air and something else, something older, that Sophia couldn't name. Every noble family in the court was present. Several had traveled from the outer territories. There were faces in that hall that had been alive when the last human empire collapsed. Sophia wore white, because she was a human princess and white was what human princesses wore, and nobody in that hall was confused about why she was there or what this was. She walked the aisle alone. Her father had not come. She had not asked him to. Caius was waiting at the altar in black so dark it absorbed the candlelight. He watched her walk toward him with the same iron-gray attention he had given her at the steps, total, unreadable, absolute. She had the strangest feeling, halfway down the aisle, that he was counting her steps. Or measuring something. Or looking for something in the way she moved. She stopped beside him. The officiant, an ancient vampire woman with white hair and small hands, began to speak in Old Nocturne, the formal tongue of the court. Sophia had spent one of her 3 weeks memorizing the necessary responses. She gave them at the right moments. Her voice did not shake. When Caius spoke his vows, he spoke them in Aldenmere Common. The formal language of her country. She had not expected that. She almost lost her place for a second, a fraction of a second, barely a breath, but she caught herself. When it was done, when the officiant said the words that made it real and permanent and binding under 2 nations' laws, Caius turned to face her. He was close. Close enough that she could see the detail in his eyes, the very faint dark ring at the outer edge of the iris that human eyes did not have. "I will not ask more of you than you agreed to," he said. Low. Quiet. Just for her. She searched his face for the architecture of a lie and did not find it. That meant nothing. He had 400 years of practice. "I agreed to be your wife," she said. "I intend to be exactly that." Something shifted in his expression. Too small to read. Too deliberate to be nothing. "Then, we understand each other," he said. And Sophia Marlowe, Princess of Aldenmere, stood in a mountain castle surrounded by the living dead and thought, no. We absolutely do not understand each other yet. But she was going to. The first month was a study in structured distance. They ate together in the evenings. Caius did not eat in the way she ate, but he sat at the table and she had learned quickly not to look at whatever was in his glass. They had conversation. Real conversation, not the formal kind. He asked about Aldenmere's agricultural seasons, she asked about the mountain pass trade routes. They argued, once, for 40 minutes about whether a particular war 3 centuries ago had been won through strategy or luck. He thought strategy. She thought luck with excellent timing. Neither of them won. He did not come to her room. She had not expected him to. The agreement had been a political marriage, and he had said he would not ask more than she agreed to, and she understood that this was his version of keeping his word. She was not sure how she felt about it. She was not sure she was ready to feel anything about it. What she did notice, in the careful way she noticed everything, he watched her. Not in a predatory way, not the way the old stories said vampires watched humans, with hunger and waiting. More the way a person watched something they were trying to understand. Like she was a text in a language he thought he knew and was now not sure about. She watched him back. That was how the first month ended. Both of them watching. Neither of them speaking about it. The treaty between their nations sitting in a locked cabinet in his study, signed and sealed, the entire foundation of everything she was doing here. She had not looked at it since the day she arrived. She was starting to wonder, in the quiet hours before dawn when the mountain wind came through the stone walls and the candles burned low, whether the treaty was the whole story. Or whether something else was beginning. By the second month, Sophia had a routine. She woke before the court did. Vampires kept late hours, by preference and by biology, and the castle was at its quietest in the early morning hours when the pale light came through the eastern windows and the hallways held only her footsteps. She had claimed the East Library for those hours. It was smaller than the main library, less organized, full of books in 8 different languages stacked in the particular chaos of a room nobody had tidied in decades. She liked it for exactly that reason. It did not feel curated. It felt lived in. As much as a room in a vampire castle could feel lived in. She was there on the morning she found Caius's writing. It was in the margin of a cartography book, old maps of the southern territories, pages worn soft with use. Someone had been making notes in the margins in a cramped, precise hand. Dates. Small observations. A note about a river that had changed course 300 years ago. A sketch of a border town that no longer existed. She turned pages and the notes continued, and she realized, slowly, that she was reading the record of someone who had been watching a landscape change for centuries. Not documenting history. Watching it. The way you watched something you cared about. She set the book down very carefully, the way you set something down when it has surprised you. She did not mention it to him that evening. But she kept the cartography book in her stack. Victor Draven did not trust her. This was not surprising, and she had not expected him to. He was Caius's younger brother by 2 decades, which, in vampire terms, meant he was 380 years old to Caius's 400, and he had the particular energy of someone who had spent a very long time being second in command to someone they both loved and resented. He was handsome in the way Caius was handsome, but sharper. Shorter patience. The kind of face that made its feelings available whether it intended to or not. He made his position clear at dinner in the 3rd week. Not loudly. Not dramatically. He simply said, in the middle of a conversation about a border dispute, of course, the treaty is the priority. As long as the treaty holds, the princess remains useful. Remains useful. The table went quiet in the particular way tables went quiet when something has been said that everyone heard and nobody is going to acknowledge. Sophia reached for her water glass. Her hand was steady. She had been trained since childhood in the art of the unshakable face, and she deployed it now with full conviction. The treaty benefits both parties equally, she said pleasantly. That's what makes it durable. She looked at Victor when she said it. He looked back. A smile moved across his face that did not reach his eyes. Caius, at the head of the table, said nothing. But she felt him watching. And, when she glanced at him, just once, just for a second, his expression had a quality she had not seen on it before. She thought, later, that it might have been something adjacent to irritation. Not at her. The thing about Caius Draven, Sophia discovered over weeks and months of careful watching, was that he was not cold the way cold-blooded things were cold. He was not indifferent. He had opinions about everything, about architecture, about the particular failure of the last 3 human treaties before this one, about the correct way to brew mountain tea, about the ethics of a war that had ended 2 centuries before she was born. He argued those opinions with total conviction and zero temperature. He stated them the way you stated facts, as though they had been settled long ago, and he was simply reminding you. The first time he was wrong, she told him. It was over that same war, a territorial dispute she had studied in depth at home, because it was used as a case study in her father's court for how not to negotiate. Caius had a version of events that was missing a key document. She knew about the document because her country's archive had a copy. She said so. He went still. What document? The Oldenmere copy of the Thornfield letter. Your version of events assumes the southern lords acted without the crown's knowledge. The letter proves they didn't. It changes the entire moral framing of the campaign. A pause. Longer than his usual pauses. You've read the Thornfield letter, he said. I grew up in a country with a very good archive. Another pause. Then, I have been operating on the wrong assumptions about that campaign for 140 years. He said it without embarrassment. Without defensiveness. Just a plain statement of fact, the way he said everything, except this time the fact was about himself. She was not ready for how much she liked that. Lena noticed before Sophia did. She said it at breakfast on a Thursday, the way Lena said most important things, between sips of tea, without preamble, in the tone of someone who has thought about this carefully and decided the kindest thing was to simply say it. You like him. Sophia did not look up from her book. He is my husband. It is not unreasonable to find him tolerable. Sophia. Lena. You stayed up until 2 in the morning arguing about road infrastructure. It is a fascinating subject. You came back to the room smiling. I had just proven my point. Lena set down her tea. You laughed. I heard you from the hallway. You were laughing at something he said. Sophia turned a page of her book. The page had nothing on it she was reading. He said something funny. In 400 years, has anyone ever told him he was funny? She did not answer that. Because she had asked him, once, what it was like, the longevity, the centuries of watching everything else change while you stayed the same. She had asked it carefully, the way you asked something you were not sure you had the right to ask. And he had been quiet for a long time before he answered. And what he said was not about the centuries. It was about the last 50 years, specifically. Being alone in this castle. His court around him and no one in it who pushed back, or argued, or told him he had the wrong source document. He said it the same way he said everything. Like a fact. No self-pity. No performance. She had thought about it every day since. She was not ready to think about what that meant. The assassination attempt came on a night when the snow was falling so thick and fast outside the castle windows that the courtyard had disappeared and there was nothing beyond the glass but white. Sophia had been walking back from the East Library. Later than usual. The corridor was empty. The candles had burned down to stubs. She was 3 hallways from her room when she heard it, a sound that was not the wind, not the building settling, not the normal sounds of a castle at night. Something deliberate. Something moving wrong. She stopped. She had spent enough time in this castle to know its sounds. She had spent enough time alive to know when something was hunting. She did not run. Running was instinct and instinct was loud. She pressed herself back against the wall and breathed slow and looked at the shape of the shadows in the hallway ahead of her, and she saw it, a figure she did not recognize, moving low, heading for the corridor that led to Caius's private rooms. She had a choice. She could go back. Find someone. Get help. Be safe, be sensible, be the human princess who stayed out of things because staying out of things was survivable. She picked up the iron candlestick holder from the alcove beside her. She had 3 brothers. 2 of them were dead now, but, before that, she had grown up fighting all 3 of them for anything from the last bread roll to the better sparring dummy. She was not fragile. She had never been fragile. She had been asked to be, many times, by many people, and she had always been politely deaf to it. She came up behind the figure in the hallway and swung. It connected. The figure went down. It also turned out to be a vampire, which she had half expected and fully not prepared for. They did not stay down the way humans stayed down. It came back up in a second, fast and furious and reaching for her, and she did not have time to be scared because scared was a feeling that required space and time and she was running out of both. She backed up. Kept the candlestick between herself and it. Yelled, not screaming, not panic, a sharp, carrying sound designed to carry down stone corridors. Caius came through the wall. Not the door. The wall. The section of the wall that turned out to be a concealed passage that she had not known existed, because nobody had told her about it, because 400 years of castle building had produced a structure full of secrets. He came through it with the particular speed that vampires had, the kind that arrived before you fully registered the departure, and he put himself between her and the intruder, and then, the intruder was simply not standing anymore. It lasted about 4 seconds. Sophia lowered the candlestick. Her arms were shaking. Not fear or adrenaline, the body's very stupid way of saying you just did something extremely high stakes and, also please sit down now. Caius turned. He looked at her. At the candlestick. At the mark on her forearm where she had blocked a grab red, not broken, it would bruise tomorrow. His jaw was tight. His eyes were the color of iron in the dark and something was moving behind them that was not his usual careful nothing. You hit him with a candlestick, he said. It was what I had. He is a vampire. I am aware. You hit a vampire with a candlestick. Caius. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I am standing here. He is on the floor. I think I made the right call. He stared at her for a long moment. The tight thing in his jaw did not relax. He reached out and touched the mark on her forearm with 2 fingers, the same way she had touched the black wax letter 9 months ago, carefully, like he was not sure what he was dealing with. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she said. That was the plan. That was where he was going. A pause so long it had its own weather. "I know," Caius said. He did not say thank you. She did not think he had said thank you to another person in a very long time. But he stood there in that corridor with his hand still near her arm and the snow still falling outside and the intruder very still on the floor, and something in his face was open in a way it had not been before. Like a door that had been keeping something in had been bumped and not quite closed again. She did not point it out. She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the mark on her arm until it faded, which took a while, which was fine, because she needed the time to think. The investigation took 2 weeks. Victor moved around the castle during that time with a particular careful quality, too present, too attentive, too interested in the progress of the inquiry. Sophia watched him the way she had been watching everything since she arrived. She was good at watching. She had developed the skill as a child, in a court full of adults who spoke freely in front of her because they had decided she was too young to understand, and she had spent those years understanding everything. She brought what she had to Caius on a Wednesday afternoon. She did not hedge it or soften it. She laid out the pieces, the timing, the access, the way the information about Caius's schedule that night had been specific enough to require an inside source, the 3 conversations she had overheard in the 2 weeks since where Victor had been a little too careful to be saying nothing. Caius listened without interrupting. "You have been building this case for 2 weeks, he said, when she finished. "Since the night it happened. You did not come to me sooner. I needed more than suspicion. Suspicion is not evidence." He was quiet. He looked at the note she had brought. She had written it down, organized it, sourced it the way her father had taught her to organize diplomatic intelligence. He turned the pages slowly. "Victor has been my brother for 380 years, he said. She did not say anything. "He has not always agreed with my decisions." Another page. "He did not want this marriage. He made that clear." "I know. He called you a political instrument." Caius set the notes down. He was not looking at them anymore. He was looking at the wall above her head and his face was doing the thing it did when he was processing something very old and very heavy. He may still believe that. "He does," Sophia said. Caius looked at her. "And what do you believe?" She did not look away from the iron gray eyes and the question sitting inside them, bigger than the words it was dressed in. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I walked into this castle as a treaty piece. I believe that was the truth 9 months ago." She stopped. Started again. "I am less certain it is the whole truth now." The quiet in that room was different from other quiets. It had weight. It had the particular density of 2 people standing on the edge of something and both of them knowing it and neither of them saying so. Caius reached across the table and picked up her notes again. He looked at them for a long time. "I will handle Victor," he said. "I know." "Sophia." She looked at him. "What you did in that corridor," he stopped. Started again, which was unusual for him. He did not usually need 2 attempts. That was not the action of someone who was here because a document said she should be. She felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been holding its position for 9 months. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She went back to her room and Lena took one look at her face and said absolutely nothing, which was the best possible thing she could have done, and Sophia sat at the window and looked at the mountains and thought about iron gray eyes and a door that hadn't quite closed, and outside the snow was beginning again, steady and quiet, covering everything. She did not pick up the cartography book that night. She did not need to. She could see his handwriting in her memory. She knew every word. The court had opinions about Sophia Marlowe. This was not new. Courts always had opinions. Courts were essentially organized opinion-having machines dressed in expensive clothing, and the Nocturne Court had had 400 years to develop its opinion-having infrastructure to a very fine point. Sophia had understood, from the first week, that she would be watched and measured and discussed. She had accepted this the way she accepted altitude sickness, an unavoidable feature of the terrain. What she had not fully anticipated was how those opinions would shift once the court realized she was staying. Not staying because the treaty required it. Staying because she had built something here. Because she had become a fixture in the East Library before dawn, in the evenings with Caius, in the small governing meetings that she had started attending and, then, contributing to and, then, quietly, reshaping. She had suggested changes to 3 border protocols in her first 6 months. All 3 had been implemented. The court had noticed. Some of them liked her for it. The older ones, mostly, the ones who had watched enough history to recognize a capable mind when it showed up dressed in Aldenmere white. Lady Vaila, who had been at the Nocturne Court for 200 years and had seen 6 political marriages come and go and taken notes on all of them, had taken to sitting near Sophia at formal dinners and asking her opinions on trade disputes in a way that was the vampire equivalent of warm. Some of them resented her for exactly the same reasons. Mira Ashbane led that faction with elegant precision. Mira was old. Not as old as Caius, but old enough that she had been part of the court for longer than any human nation currently existed. She was striking in the way very old vampires were striking, fine-boned and pale and possessed of a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. She had expected to be queen. This was not a rumor, this was a thing several members of the court had confirmed to Sophia in various indirect ways over the months, the way people confirm things they want you to know but don't want to say. Mira had been positioned for it. Had waited for it. Had considered it settled. And then, a human princess had arrived with ink-stained fingers and a candlestick and an opinion about road infrastructure, and the whole arrangement had changed. Mira was not loud about her resentment. She was much worse than loud. She was patient. The assembly was called in the 12th month. Once a year, the full Nocturne Court gathered in the Great Hall for the formal review of court law, alliances, and, most critically, any challenges to standing agreements. It was one of the oldest traditions in vampire governance. Everything was on the table. Everything could be questioned. Everything had to be publicly defended. Sophia had known about it. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, methodically, and with the particular focused energy of someone who had been raised to take threats seriously. She had not quite anticipated the specific shape of how it arrived. Mira rose during the 3rd hour of the assembly, when the hall had warmed to the particular temperature of 200 vampires who had all been awake since midnight and had very strong opinions. She was dressed in deep blue, which Sophia noticed because Mira was never accidental about anything, including color. She rose and asked, with perfect formal courtesy, for the court's attention on the matter of the Aldenmere Treaty. Sophia, seated to the right of Caius at the head of the table, kept her face the way it always was at moments like this. Still. Open. Giving nothing. Mira laid out her case with the fluency of someone who had been practicing law before human kingdoms were a concept. The treaty was a political document. It had served its purpose, the mountain passes were secured, Aldenmere was stable, the neutrality was intact. The question the court was now obligated to ask, she said, with a reasonableness that was a weapon wearing a reasonable face, was whether the terms of the treaty continued to serve the court's interests. Specifically, whether the continued presence of a human princess as queen consort was strategically necessary now that the original conflict had stabilized. The great hall was very quiet. Sophia heard what Mira was not quite saying, in the space between the words she was saying. Whether Sophia was necessary. Whether she had served her function. Whether the court needed to continue housing a human political token dressed in a queen's title. She felt the words land in her chest with the particular weight of things you have already, secretly, been afraid of. Then, she felt something else, a clean, clarifying anger that had nothing sweet about it. Mira kept talking. She talked about precedent, about 3 previous treaty marriages in the court's history and how they had been resolved when the treaty's terms were fulfilled. She talked about the court's long-term interests, about the question of succession, about the importance of the Nocturne Court maintaining its sovereignty free from human political entanglement. She talked, and the hall listened, and Sophia watched the faces around the table, the older nobles, the military commanders, the regional lords who held the passes, and she read the room with the precision of 11 months of practice. Some of them were nodding. Not many. But enough. She did not look at Caius during Myra's speech. She could feel him beside her. Could feel the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of someone receiving new information but the stillness of someone who had already done all their thinking and arrived. When Myra finished, the hall waited. Caius did not stand immediately. He sat for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, in the particular way that very powerful people sat when they wanted a room to understand they were choosing their timing rather than reacting to it. Then, he stood. He was not a man who used rooms dramatically. He did not need to. 400 years of presence meant the room adjusted to him, not the other way around. When Caius Draven stood in the great hall of the Nocturne Court, everything else did the sensible thing and went quiet. "The treaty," he said. His voice carried without effort. "Lady Ashvane has asked this court to consider the treaty's continued relevance." He looked around the table, and it was the particular look he gave to things he had already decided about, not aggressive, not dismissive, just settled. "The treaty is a binding document between the Nocturne Court and the Kingdom of Aldenmere. It is housed in my study. It is signed by both kings. It is," he said, "a piece of paper." A pause. "I am aware," he continued, "that Lady Ashvane's concern is not truly about the paper. Her concern is about the woman seated at this table. Whether she belongs here. Whether her presence is justified by the document. Whether, now that the document has served its purpose, the woman can be set aside." The quality of the quiet in the hall changed. It became more focused. More attentive. Caius looked at Myra. "I want to address that question directly." He turned from the table and walked to his study. The door was at the far end of the hall. He had used it before for documents needed mid-session. The court watched him go. The court watched him return. He was carrying the treaty. Sophia's eyes found it immediately, the heavy wax seal, the familiar formal header. The document she had not looked at since the day she arrived. The document that had defined her presence here. That had been the justification, the framing, the entire official story of why she was sitting in that chair. Caius set it on the table in front of him. Then, he picked up the candle from the holder to his left. The great hall understood what was happening before Sophia did. She saw it in the faces, the instant attention, the collective stillness. She saw Lady Viola's eyes sharpen. She saw Myra's expression do something complicated and fast. She saw the military commanders straighten in their chairs. Caius held the candle to the bottom corner of the treaty. The paper caught. It burned slowly at first, parchment was dense and did not rush, and then the flame found its pace and the signatures went, and the seals went, and the formal language of both nations' obligations went with them. He held it until it was more fire than document, and then he set it in the iron basin on the table and let it finish. Nobody spoke. The ash settled. Caius looked at the court. Then he looked at Sophia. "She is not here because of that document," he said. "She has not been here because of that document for a very long time. She is here because she walked into this castle alone and learned its rhythms and studied its history and argued with me for 3 hours about a war I had the wrong source for. A beat. She is here because she picked up an iron candlestick in a dark corridor when any sensible person would have run. She is here because she spent 2 weeks building an evidence case that I would not have had the political clarity to build myself. Another beat, shorter this time. She is here because I choose her to be here. Not the treaty. Not the strategy. Not Aldenmere's passes or Aldenmere's neutrality. Me." He looked at Myra. "You asked whether her presence is justified by the document. The document is gone. Her presence is justified by her. If this court wishes to debate that justification, we can. I have time. He sat down. The hall was so quiet Sophia could hear the fire in the grate across the room. She looked at the ash in the iron basin. She had not known he was going to do that. She had not asked him to. No one had asked him to. He had sat in that chair for the whole of Myra's speech and arrived at that decision entirely by himself, and had gotten up and done it without announcement or theater, the way he did everything, because he had thought about it and it was right and so it was done. She felt something in her chest break open in a way that had nothing to do with breaking. She did not cry. She was in the great hall of the Nocturne Court in front of 200 vampires, and she was not going to cry, and that was final. But her eyes burned for a second, precisely 1 second, and she took a slow breath and let it pass. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. The iron-gray eyes had the door-not-quite-closed quality they had developed since the corridor, since the notes, since the war she had corrected him on open in a way that she had come to understand was as much as 400 years of careful distance would allow at once. "Thank you," she said. Low. Just for him. The same way he had spoken to her at the altar a year ago. He inclined his head. "You were worth it." Mira left the table before the assembly was formally closed. The political mathematics of her position had shifted in the space of 3 minutes into something non-viable, and she was too intelligent to sit with it publicly. Sophia watched her go without satisfaction and without cruelty. She understood what it was to have positioned yourself for something and had the position removed. She understood it from the inside. The assembly closed. The hall emptied in the slow, dignified way courts emptied when something significant had happened and everyone needed time to process it before they could perform normal social behavior again. Lady Viola stopped beside Sophia's chair on her way out. She was 200 years old and had the eyes of someone who had watched every kind of human drama and developed exact and specific opinions about it. "The last queen consort of the Nocturne Court lasted 4 years, she said. She was removed when the treaty expired. "I know," Sophia said. "The one before her lasted 6. Viola looked at the ash in the basin. "I do not expect you to have the same problem." She moved on without waiting for a response, because 200-year-old women did not wait for responses if they had said what they came to say. That night, for the first time in 12 months, Caius knocked on her door. She opened it. He was standing in the hallway with no particular ceremony about it, no formal occasion, no political reason. Just standing there the way people stood at doors when they had decided to do something and gotten to the doing of it. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him through the castle. Not to his study, not to the great hall. Up a staircase she had never used, in a part of the castle she had not yet reached in her explorations. It wound upward for longer than she expected and opened onto the roof. Not a formal terrace. Not a designed space. Just the raw top of the castle, stone and open air and the whole of the mountain range visible in every direction under a sky full of stars that were clearer at this altitude than she had ever seen them in her life. She stood at the edge of the parapet and looked at it. The mountains went on forever in every direction, dark shapes against the deep blue of the sky. The air was cold and clean and tasted like nothing she had a word for. "I have not shown anyone this view in 40 years, Caius said. He was standing beside her. Close in the new way, the post-corridor way, not the formal 3 steps behind way. I stopped coming up here because there was no one to bring." She looked at him. The starlight was doing something very specific to his face and she was not going to catalog it because she was already managing a significant amount of feeling and she had limits. "Caius." "Sophia. You burned the treaty." "Yes." "In front of the entire court." "Yes." She looked back at the mountains. "You know this means my father is going to want a new one." He was quiet for a moment. Then, she heard it low, almost surprised, the kind of sound that did not come easily from someone who had not needed to make it very often. He laughed. It was a short laugh. Quiet. But real, fully, unguardedly real, without any of the careful management his face usually applied to his expressions. It sounded like someone who had forgotten how to do a thing and was remembering. She turned and looked at him full on. He was still smiling. Not performing it. Just there. Open. We will write him a better document, Caius said. One that is accurate. Accurate how? The smile faded, but the openness stayed. Accurate in that it does not call you a political arrangement. Accurate in that it says what you are. She waited. The mountain wind moved between them. The stars were enormous. What am I? She asked. She did not mean it the way the court meant it. She meant it the way the cartography book meant it. What specific, precise thing? What word did he have, after 12 months of watching and arguing and building cases together in the dark? What had he arrived at, in the careful, thorough way he arrived at everything? Mine, he said. And then, before she could answer, if you want to be. Not a command. Not a treaty. Not a piece of paper with a wax seal and both nations' signatures. Just a question. From a man who had spent 400 years surrounded by people and been alone inside all of it, standing on a rooftop with stars overhead and the mountains going in every direction and his hands at his sides, open and still, waiting to hear what she would choose. Sophia Marlowe had spent 12 months in this castle. She had learned its hallways and its history and its language and its sounds. She had argued with its king about wars that ended before her grandparents were born. She had hit an assassin with a candlestick because the alternative was unthinkable. She had felt something she was not ready to name for a very long time become something she could no longer pretend was unnamed. Yes, she said. She said it the way he burned the treaty, without announcement. Without theater. Because she had thought about it and it was right and so it was done. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was cold in the way she had stopped noticing. The way you stopped noticing a thing when it became simply part of what was real. They stood on the roof of the Nocturne Castle under the clearest sky she had ever seen. The ash of the treaty had long gone cold in the iron basin 2 floors below. Somewhere in Alden Mere, her father was probably still waiting for the diplomatic report she had not sent yet. Somewhere in the East Library, a cartography book sat with its margins full of 300 years of careful observation. Down in the great hall, Lady Vaila was probably drinking very old wine and taking notes. The mountains held them on all sides, dark and enormous and permanent, and Sophia Marlowe stood inside all of it and felt, for the first time since a Tuesday letter with black wax, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because a document said so. Because she was.